While the weather conditions have improved, as you would have heard as reported from New South Wales and Victoria, there are still many fires that are raging, and there is a very significant firefighting effort which is continuing. The better conditions today obviously will assist, but it's important to stress, as I've been advised, that the nature of those fires is still very strong, and it will take some time, and that will require a considerable amount of effort, and we absolutely understand that that is where the primary focus is, particularly of the fire commissioners as they're addressing that very urgent task. Today I wanted to provide you with an update on the work of the ADF, both yesterday and what their focus is today. I'm joined by the Minister for Defence and also joined by Minister Littleproud. And later today, the Minister for Defence will be joined by members of the Australian Defence Force to commence what will be a regular operational briefing conducted at Russell by those who are operationally responsible for those matters, of course, which you'll be invited to attend, and they can provide a lot more of the detail than I'll be providing here today, because it's appropriate for that to be done on that basis, and you can direct any quite specific questions to them. Later today I'll be joining the Premier of New South Wales and the Royal Fire Service Commissioner Fitzsimmons in New South Wales to look at that particular effort that's been undertaken by the Australian Defence Force. What I can tell you is that the focus of the ADF today is to be making assessments of the need and to work with the various state agencies as to how best they can now move forward and meet those needs in the critical areas. In the last 24 hours in Victoria, Navy support has, of course, included Navy ships evacuating some 1,100 isolated persons from Malakuta. The MV Sycamore arrived in Western Port this morning on the Mornington Peninsula with 61 evacuees and pets. The HMS Choules arrived in Western Port, that was on Saturday I should say, some 1,100 evacuees, which, as I said yesterday, that is in addition to what can normally be taken on board that vessel. Those two vessels are now returning to Malakuta, and I understand that the Sycamore is already there. The Choules has been reprovisioned and will be making its way there also. Black Hawk helicopter support has been provided and based out of RAF-based East Sale, and has been involved in transporting firefighters from Bensdale to Malakuta and transporting the injured and vulnerable from Malakuta to East Sale to receive medical treatment by emergency services. 3 Chinook helicopters are operating also from the RAF-based East Sale to provide support to those firefighting operations. These were already involved in evacuating people from remote townships in eastern Victoria, and ADF helicopters evacuated 42 people from Omeo last night, and you would have seen some of the footage of that. Another 3 Chinooks are preparing to deploy south from Townsville, and the first of those will depart today. The mobility operations, the JTF, the Joint Task Force, is providing engineering personnel and equipment to support state capabilities to clear and reopen roads. Now that includes moving forward some heavy engineering equipment up to East Sale so they can be operating in those parts of East Gippsland. I should stress that when they're seeking to clear these roads, it isn't just a matter of moving the debris, as I'm sure you're probably aware, off the road themselves. And I see Phil here, he's probably experienced that firsthand over the last couple of days. It is also being aware of the assessment of falling trees that are adjacent to the roads, and there needs to be a technical assessment made of those things as well. So I just make that point. Just because you can see the road clear doesn't, and it may still be closed, there are very serious reasons why people will be taking great care to ensure those roads are safe before people can move through them. ADF will also be engaged with damage assessments, as they've been doing for some time now. As you've heard from both Victoria and New South Wales this morning, we won't know the full impact of the devastating fires last night until there's been an opportunity for those teams, and we always prepare ourselves for difficult information once those assessments teams starts to move through the areas as they get access to them. As you were reporting yourselves last night, it was very difficult to get eyes on many parts of the fire because of the heavy smoke, which we can physically see outside of this building today, and in those parts was even more extreme. And so that was very difficult last night to see where they were going, but they did an extraordinary job, and their predictive technology proved to be very accurate. But what we need to note is that now those as assessment teams go through, they'll be able to inspect what damage has been incurred in those places, and then that will assist in terms of the support that will now be needed in those communities. Air traffic controllers are also providing flight information service at Bairnsdale Airport, and a P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft is conducting a route reconnaissance from Sale to Malakuta to assess the engineering requirement. The HMAS Adelaide has on board heavy engineering equipment which can be used to support road clearing from the other side. Where you can get equipment in from the land side, there is the potential for that to also be done on the sea side through the landing that engineering equipment, and those, of course, assessments will be made as about what's the most appropriate way to do that, and that will be done under the direction of the state agencies. In New South Wales, the engineering support, there are crews from our engineering operations as well as our logistic operations going into a number of areas, working closely with the New South Wales Government to assess what capabilities and needs will be needed in those areas. That will also include the deployment where needed of medical teams, and these can be quite small medical teams which can deal with a first sort of level of assistance to people in these areas. The HMS Adelaide, which is down around about where Eden is presently, means that there is a potential to supply from that point, not just medical support but also other essentials that may be necessary in those areas. But again, this will be done in close coordination with the state authorities as we assess that need. There are 400 personnel on the Adelaide, and there is 300 tonnes of relief supplies on the Adelaide, and it is in position, just as the Tules will be soon, back on the southeastern coast, and the other vessels are already there. In terms of helicopter support, Army and Navy are providing maximum capacity operations through a combination of the Taipan Seahawk and EC-135 helicopters for fire mapping, surveillance and search and rescue support operations, supporting New South Wales Rural Fire Service throughout Hunter, Greater Sydney, Illawarra and southern regions. In terms of going forward, fire trail clearance will be undertaken from the 6th to 10th of January out in Mudgee. In terms of transport and logistics, an expansion of the ground transport and logistics tasks is already supported in 5 new locations from Tamworth, Mudgee, Nowra, Maitland and Queanbeyan. In recovery operations, the ADF is providing personnel and equipment to undertake initial recovery tasks as identified. These tasks will be in Tamworth, Wallandilly, Nowra, Mudgee, Maitland and Winch-Carriby, and they will commence from the 6th. There's special logistics, as I mentioned, moving into particular areas to make those assessments about what is needed, and the transport of firefighters will continue as has been happening for some time. The ADF is currently engaging with the New Zealand Defence Force and the Singapore Armed Forces to identify options for the officers of military support that they have generously put forward, and Papua New Guinea government has also made similar offers through the Prime Minister to me directly, which has been passed on to the ADF for them to progress. Before I pass on to the Minister of Defence, I referred yesterday to the fact that the government would be standing up a recovery agency to support the recovery effort. The National Bushfire Recovery Agency was considered yesterday at the National Security Committee, and it will be stood up and it will be led by the former AFP Commissioner, Andrew Colvin, who has accepted that role, and he will be there today. It will be established within PM&C. It will be modelling its operations very closely on the successful response that was provided to the North Queensland floods, where we stood up the agency in that situation, which was led by Shane Stone. That organisation worked extremely closely and extremely well with the Queensland Government. That agency will be drawing on a series of support measures. They will be particularly in the area of income supports, and I'll have more to say about that tomorrow after Cabinet considers further issues on this. But in those floods and also in the drought response that has been going now for some time. There have been a range of payments that have been made to support small businesses. There have been payments made to support councils with the re-establishing of critical infrastructure, and in some cases, particularly after those floods, and it's the same cases in many of the rural areas, there's fences to be rebuilt, there's carcasses to be removed of animals who have been caught in these fires, and that is a fairly grisly operation, but that's an operation that needs to be done, and it needs to be done as soon as you possibly can. And so that agency, which will report to Minister Littleproud, established it within PMC, will work right across government. This will include dealing with things like coordinating mental health support into particular areas. Those of you who have been in some of these areas will know that this fire and the haze and the fear and the quite extreme conditions would have had a profound impact on the mental health and well-being of people in communities, not just in those areas where people are resident, but people who would have been there during the course of these fires. And so it's important that we are addressing the mental health needs as well as the many other health needs that will need to be addressed. This organisation will be stood up for at least 2 years, and we'll be able to talk more about its funding arrangements in the not-too-distant future after Cabinet considers the formal proposals which are coming forward and have already been considered by the National Security Committee. But it's important that that agency work closely, as it will, as similar agencies have in the past, with what the states and territories are doing. I will not be seeking matching funding from states and territories for what is the Commonwealth will be providing. I have no doubt that they will have a long list of recovery tasks that they will be performing, as we saw in Queensland, rebuilding of bridges, rebuilding of roads and other critical infrastructure. And we will just work hand in glove, as we have in response to previous crises, to ensure that the recovery commences and is undertaken in a timely way, and getting that support, particularly to small businesses. The number of small business people, I met a fellow down in Bega who just said, "Mate, my business is gone. My business is gone." And so it's important that they can start to think and have options about how they're going to be able to get through, particularly the next few months and beyond, and then to work closely with the recovery support that's available to then make decisions and plan for their future. And so that agency will be tasked with ensuring that those forms of income support are in place for those arrangements. So with those two, the update on our defence operations as well as the announcement of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, I'll hand over to the Minister of Defence and then David to make a few comments.
Well, Prime Minister, thank you very much. And as the bushfire emergency escalates, both in scale and time, so too is the ADF's response. For the past 2 months, we've had 2,000 defence personnel, both from Army, Air Force and Navy, on the ground supporting civilian emergency services. As the Prime Minister has said, that has escalated significantly, and as we announced yesterday, we've raised that again. So my job over the next few days and weeks is to ensure that Defence provides all possible support to initially the humanitarian assistance and also disaster relief activities across all bushfire-affected areas. So the main activities for the next, moving forward for the next week is, as the Prime Minister has said, we are moving more helicopter assets, both from Australia and now looking to source some additional helicopter support from allies overseas. We're also making some significant movements into the affected states of Army assets, particularly vehicles and engineering support. We're working with the State and Federal Health Department to have a look at what more we can do together in providing medical assistance, not only on the HMAS Adelaide and Choules, but also deploying medical teams out to remote communities who need that support. We now have 3 naval vessels on call. As the Prime Minister has said, HMAS Adelaide steamed from Sydney yesterday with 400 personnel, 300 tonnes of relief supplies, hospital on board, and so that is now rendezvousing with the Choules and also the Sycamore, which have dropped their 1,100 evacuees off at Western Port in Victoria. So in relation to what those naval vessels do next, we are liaising with the Victorian and New South Wales government to ensure we make best use of those naval assets over coming days. We are also now standing up our 3 new task forces. The first one based out of Victoria, based in 4 Brigade in Melbourne. We are that's progressing very well. We've also stood up a joint task force based out of the 5th Brigade headquarters in Sydney, and also now out of 9th Brigade in Adelaide and Tasmania. We've activated these brigades through the call-out to ensure that we have the maximum possible trained personnel available to support the efforts in their states. We've also activated Army Reserve elements from 17 Brigade, which again is headquartered in New South Wales, for their specialist logistics support. So as we said yesterday, we are making sure that we have the maximum possible specialist people, aircraft, naval vessels and other equipment out forward, so that we can respond very quickly to emerging requirements at the community level. The implementation of the call-out, which we initiated yesterday, we requested from the Governor-General yesterday, is now underway. If anybody who is watching or listening would like further information about the call-out, they can contact 1800-DEFENCE to provide further information. And from tomorrow, the major newspapers will also contain information on the call-out and its implication for the personnel involved, for their families and also their employers. In addition to this additional support, we continue to provide, as the Prime Minister has just gone through in some detail, all of the support that we have been doing for the past 2 months, doing surveillance, reconnaissance, flying firefighters, overseas firefighters and Australian firefighters to where they're needed across the country. We've been doing emergency engineering work. We've been feeding hundreds of firefighters and accommodating them across the country, and we are now also making bases available for evacuees who need accommodation and health care. So please be assured that the Defence Forces are doing everything that they possibly can to assist Australians across the country who are in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. David.
Thanks, PM. And I think it is important for Australians to understand, while conditions have abated, we are still in a severe fire season, and conditions can turn in the coming days and weeks that mean people will still be in harm's way. So I say to every Australian, you must have your plan, you must enact on that plan, you must listen to those brave men and women, those emergency service personnel, when they give you direction. Do it. You owe it to them. You owe it to those brave 3 Australians who served their community and their nation and lost their lives serving us. It is not a she'll be right situation yet, and we've got to make sure that we work as a nation and we have those plans enacted and ready to move on them. Obviously, announcing Andrew Colvin in this agency is an important step in the recovery, and we've already committed over $100 million already in direct payments to those that have been impacted, but also to the New South Wales Government in the recovery of these fires. This is about making sure that we don't just have a Canberra solution to this. This has to be a localised solution, whether it be in Kangaroo Island, whether it be Mallacoota, whether it be in Stanthorpe. We need to make sure that the recovery is tailored to those local communities to get them back up on their feet. This is not just about building the infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure. It's also the huge numbers of native species that we've lost through these fires, but also this is about rebuilding the lives of those Australians that have been hurt by these devastating fires. We're not just going to build the infrastructure, we're going to rebuild the lives. And it's important that as they go through this grief of this disastrous event, they understand that their nation is with them. They share that grief, and together we will rebuild their lives and get them back up to where they were before. We're a proud nation, we're a rich nation, and we don't intend to leave any stone unturned. We owe it to our fellow Australians who have been impacted by these severe fires.
Thank you, David. So to conclude the opening statements, can I again thank all of the state premiers? Can I thank again all the fire commissioners for the extraordinary work they've been doing in integrating and coordinating with each other and with the Commonwealth? Can I thank all of those who have been out there in incredibly difficult conditions overnight? Like many of you, I was observing last night those individuals who are gathering together down on the Eden Wharf, and I can understand the great sense of anxiety as some of them now, as they left their homes, at some point will be able to go back and check on what has happened to their properties. But the calmness and the order and the stability in which people responded last night and followed the messages, I thought was extraordinary, and I think greatly assisted the authorities as they went about the task they had to go through last night. But to all of those, thank you so much for the way that you've been responding, and Commonwealth, states, local government will continue to provide the support and response and coordination needed. Chris.
Prime Minister, how do you respond to the New South Wales Rural Fire Service Chief's statement that he was disappointed and surprised by being blindsided by your announcement yesterday, and that when the call did go to Gladys Berejiklian, it came 5 minutes before your announcement, which some of the New South Wales government are saying shows a fundamental lack of professional courtesy?
Well, in terms of the last point, I don't agree with that point, but what I would say is that this matter was dealt with at National Security Committee yesterday. I left that National Security Committee meeting and then went out and I contacted premiers and advised them of the decisions that we were taking. And I want to stress that the decisions that we took yesterday and enacted yesterday were a statement all about the scale of this crisis. It is in no way a statement on the performance of the state and territory agencies. I've been consistently complimentary and remain absolutely complimentary of their extraordinary work. And without their work, without their planning, without their preparations, then I fear what has already been a terrible tragedy would have been far worse. And so we have enjoyed, as the Commissioner himself has said, a very strong working relationship. There was a breakdown in communications at the Defence Liaison level with the headquarters yesterday. That matter was addressed by the Minister for Defence yesterday, and she made comment about that this morning in the media. And so there's been a subsequent conversation between myself and the Premier and the Minister in New South Wales, and we've addressed any of those issues that arose from that. I mean, we communicated the decision as soon as it had been made to all states and territories, particularly those who are affected. Today, last night, I'm in South Australia at Kangaroo Island. I know the Premier is there today attending to those issues. All of those premiers who were directly affected were contacted and understand, I believe, that the nature of this support is to supplement, to support, to cut down any response times, to ensure that what we're all focused on, whether it's myself, the Premier in New South Wales or any other state, or the Commissioner in New South Wales or anywhere else, is just trying to get as much support and coordinated effort in as quickly as possible.
Prime Minister, you've announced more air tankers yesterday.
Yeah.
You announced $11 million in funding in December, but there have been calls for a long time now for more capacity with aerial firefighting and more contributions from the federal government. Why wasn't more done by the federal government sooner to put in funding ahead of the bushfire season? Have you been putting in too little, too late?
Well, David, I addressed this yesterday at the press conference we had yesterday. The response that we made was to provide the additional funding last year of $11 million and this year of $11 million, which brought it up to the level that was being sought in those years. And in this year's budget, that will be provided again on an ongoing basis. And so after becoming Prime Minister, they were matters that we put in train with that additional funding and resource. And as was noted yesterday, at 8 p.m. the previous evening, we received the request for an additional water bombing asset, and we moved to provide 4 with an additional $20 million. So when you look at that over the scheme over the last couple of years and the additional resource that has been provided on top of our standing commitment of $15 million, it means that the resources were delivered and now will ensure are there on an ongoing basis.
PM, on the recovery and reconstruction arrangements that you've announced today, the Black Saturday Royal Commission put the cost of those fires at $4.4 billion. It's obviously early days, but do you have an estimate of the cost of these fires? And in terms of the financing arrangements and things like that, there'll be a hit to agriculture and tourism from this. Are you looking at, can you fund the reconstruction from within the budget, or will you be looking at things like a levy or something like that to protect the surplus?
Well, let me deal with those in turn. The cost, well, the fires are not over. The crisis is not over. There are months to go, and particularly in the southern states, and speaking to Premier Hodgman, in Tasmania and in Victoria, their more difficult seasons usually come later in January and in February. So there is still a long way to go, and sadly there will still be more cost that will be incurred as a result of the devastating impacts. And so the recovery need is going to be great, very great. And that recovery, the rebuilding, will be done. It will be done supported by the Commonwealth Government, by the state governments, by the local governments. And the Commonwealth will be acting across all those tiers, providing financial support, both directly, whether it's primary producers, to small businesses, to local councils and others, to engage in that rebuilding effort. There will be no levy, because we have been ensuring that we've been in a position to be able to deal with matters such as this. And so we will be committing everything that is needed and more as it is required. Cabinet will be considering the details of that, but there is already a firm proposal that was considered by National Security Committee yesterday about what the initial investment will be, and I'll make further announcements about that with the Treasurer tomorrow. And so we will be focusing on what the need is and ensuring that that is met. Sorry? I'll give further details about that tomorrow after it's been considered by Cabinet.
Just in relation to you've been heavily criticised for your handling of the whole situation. Can Australians still have faith in your leadership and that you're able to lead them through this disaster?
I'll continue to demonstrate what we're doing through our actions. Sure, there's been a lot of commentary. There's been plenty of criticism. I've had the benefit of a lot of analysis on a lot of issues. But I can't be distracted by that. And the public, I know, are not distracted by that. What they need us to focus on, all of us, actually, all of us, focusing on the needs there in the communities and getting the support where it needs to go. That's very much where my focus is, and that's where it will continue to be, working closely with the states and territories, working closely with my ministers and the agencies, the Defence Forces, the new Recovery Agency, to be led by Mr Colvin, and ensuring that they have the support, resources and communications that they need.
What do you say though to criticism that the ADF announcement yesterday came too slow? Do you believe you could or should have announced it earlier, a week ago or before Christmas? And could that deployment, the use of the ADF and the assets have helped in the fire crisis over the last couple of years?
Well, the question assumes that the ADF wasn't present or doing anything, and that's not the case. As you know, the ADF has been present and involved significantly and heavily at the request of state agencies now for many months, going back to Canungra in September, and they've been deploying consistently since that time. The announcement we made yesterday was the first ever, as we understand it, compulsory call out our reservists to provide support in relation to a domestic natural disaster. Now that is an unprecedented step, and that step was taken as a consequence of the sheer scale that had moved beyond what is the reasonable expectation of any agency or state or territory authority. It is a statement of the scale of the need, not a statement of the response of any agencies up until that point in time. And it needed to be stepped up. And as I said yesterday, this was something that we were building up to week by week by week. That commenced with deploying ADF liaison officers directly into local incident response centres to ensure that they were more quickly aware of needs on the ground that could be channelled up through their chain of command, and that could be raised at headquarters level to ensure that the needs were there and people were aware of what responses could be provided. And that now will continue in a more proactive way. And so this is what was needed yesterday. This will be needed now for some period of time. I should stress, whether it's the additional payments that have been made for income loss for volunteer firefighters or what was announced yesterday, this is the most significant, this is the most comprehensive and the most dramatic in terms of escalation of a response by a Commonwealth Government that we've seen to a disaster such as this. And I believe that's where we need to focus our attention. And we are seeking, obviously, to communicate that directly to Australians to ensure that they can have comfort that the response is matching the need. Phil.
On the topic of climate change, you've stated several times in recent months that Australia's contribution to global emissions cannot be blamed for the climate change that's driving this crisis. Given that, can you give a commitment to people in this country that Australia will use whatever diplomatic influence it can to pressure bigger allies like the United States and countries like China, the big polluters, given we're now at the forefront of this, to do more? I mean, can you use your relationship with Donald Trump, for example, as fruitless as it may be, to pressure him to rejoin Paris, given your own country is now, at the forefront of the effects of climate change? Well,
I should stress that there is no dispute in this country about the issue of climate change globally and its effect on global weather patterns, and that includes how that impacts in Australia. Because I have to correct the record here. I've seen a number of people suggest that somehow the government does not make this connection. The government, our leaders, always made that connection, and that has never been in dispute. What we are focused on is what our response is, and we set that out very clearly, and that response, as it always has, will continue to be upgraded to ensure we meet and beat the commitments that we have made. Now, I participate in these discussions globally all the time, and if you look actually at what's occurring in the United States and you look what their emissions trajectory is currently, you will note that that is not increasing, as I am advised. And whether that's done and it is achieved in isolation and as an individual country, or how they choose to engage in international agreements, is ultimately a matter for sovereign governments to determine. Other governments are engaged in their commitments, but I'm pleased to say Australia is one of the countries that can say that this year, as we face this crisis, as climate change has impacted on the world's weather patterns that have led to where we are here today to some extent, combined with many other factors, the drought being the most significant, that right now Australia is beating the commitments that have been made in 2020. And there are very few countries that can make that claim. So in terms of our response, particularly what we've been able to do, which means our emissions per year are 50 million tonnes less on average each year than when we first came to government. Now, this is something that has been achieved through many efforts, but they included the efforts of the government as well to ensure we can be in that position and meet the targets we have. So we will continue to engage in all those fora, as we most recently have. But most importantly, we'll continue to carry our share of that burden and demonstrate that through the way that we are going to meet and beat our emissions reduction targets to ensure we can have the proper effect on global temperatures.
The Prime Minister has obviously copped a bit of a belting for going to Hawaii during the bushfire crisis. Minister Reynolds, have you taken any leave during this period? Have you been out of the country at all?
Well, like many of my colleagues, I've certainly spent time with my family over Christmas, but throughout that time I can assure you that I have been regularly on the phone with the CDF, with the Prime Minister, with Minister Littleproud, constantly. So
you haven't been out of the country or anything?
I have had a holiday with my family for a few days over Christmas, but again, I wasn't on leave.
Were you in Bali?
Yes, I was.
Were you on holidays in Bali?
I was spent a few days with my family, yes. But again, I was in total contact with the Prime Minister and the Secretary and CDF.
All the announcements that we've made have continued to work closely, as all Cabinet Ministers have worked together and directly with their state and territory counterparts.
Just in response to Andrew's question earlier, are you still confident you can bring down a budget surplus this financial year, given the financial costs that you're now going to face?
Well, based on my mid-year statement and my discussions with the Treasurer is a member of the National Security Committee, as is the Minister for Finance, and we considered those matters yesterday, and the commitments that we can make, particularly what are needed right now, we can meet within our budget requirements as they are currently assessed. Obviously, as you go into the budget, there are other economic parameters which will impact on that ultimate outcome, and I can't foreshadow those at this present point in time. But based on the financial position that was outlined not that long ago in the mid-year statement, then that enables us, particularly this year, to be in a position, and next year to be able to provide significant support. Chris.
Australia is a federation. States are primarily responsible for fighting fires, but what seems to be extraordinary about this circumstance this summer is they're burning in Queensland, in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia, Western Australia. Is it time for a national royal commission into this specific circumstance so that we can know what could have been done that might not have been done and how we proceed from here? Would you consider that?
Certainly, and it's something I'd consider in concert with the states and territories. These are matters that we're assessing right now. But right now, the message I have from state premiers and from fire commissioners is we're fighting the fires now. We're dealing with the emergency response now. We're dealing with the coordination and delivery of resources right now. And there is broad agreement about the need, as there always is after any natural disaster, for there to be a thorough and proper review of both the contributing factors and the response and improvements that can be made. And it has been that very process in the past that has led to so many improvements that have been on display as we've dealt with this current catastrophic season. So, of course, Chris, what form that ultimately takes is something that I work closely with the Premiers on.
And strategically, as we all know, anyone who's travelled to any coastal town in Australia, there is one road in and one road out of every town in Australia. Again, do we have to look at the way our infrastructure is set up in terms of trying to remove people from harm's way?
Well, there's not only that, there's matters that I've referred to also around planning and building regulations and where people are allowed to build residences and in what circumstances, and the land clearing arrangements. And of course, hazard reduction has been a constant refrain as I've been on the ground, but I also acknowledge that drought conditions can make that very difficult on occasion. But we also know there have been many occasions where that hazard reduction has been actively resisted, and that is something that we'll have to learn from as well. So I think they're all very valid points that you're making, and they're certainly things that will be considered and brought together initially in terms of initial lessons and immediate takeouts for action when Premiers rightly meet, when there's the opportunity to do that as been scheduled in March. I think that gives the appropriate time to bring forward some immediate steps and for those to be considered by Premiers before moving to broader scale reviews. So there hasn't been a question up the back. I'm happy to move it around. Yep.
You've mentioned hazard reduction. There's a bit of talk out there on the ground as well about the Greens being blamed and environment's been blamed for the state of these bushfires. Do you buy into that at all?
Look, there's been a lot of blame being thrown around, and now's a time to focus on the response that is being made. Plenty of people have blamed me, people have blamed the Greens, people have blamed who knows. Honestly, blame doesn't help anybody at this time. An over-analysis of those things, I think, is not a productive exercise. The appropriate exercise at the moment is coming together, as David was just saying. That's the other piece of feedback that I get in response to a lot of the noise and blame and commentary and analysis on particular issues that are a long way away from the main issue which we're needing to focus on. And there's a frustration in elements of the community that too much attention is being placed on that at the moment, and there is a need for the community to want to come together. Despite the great frustration, despite the heavy sense of loss and the heavy sense of grief and the fear. I mean, one part of this fire crisis and catastrophe across the country, which is not unprecedented in one way, but its extent, I think, is more extreme than we've seen, and that is the smoke and the haze that sits over this city now, that sits over my home city in Sydney, that sits in many places along the coast and the fire-affected areas. And that haze, that smoke, apart from its direct health effects, which are also of concern, really does, I think, impact on people's sense of well-being, and that can have broader impacts about how people are feeling through these events. And despite all that, I've been so impressed by the calmness and the support that people have provided. And so, I understand that. I really do. Jenny and I understand it. I mean, our kids are here. They breathe the smoke like anybody else, and we have the same concerns that others do who would be in an area that is not impacted directly by fire, but these things. But it makes it very ever-present in people's minds. And I can understand that, how that contributes to how people are feeling about this issue around the country. And so that is acknowledged. But what most importantly is needed is that we just keep working together. And we are. Premiers, commissioners, prime ministers, local mayors, local volunteer workers, police, emergency services, paramedics, rural fire service volunteers, emergency services, Sir John's ambulance. The list is long. It's incredibly long. And then there are those other stories of incredible kindness as people have gone to the checkout with a bag full of groceries or things that they've needed, and they've looked like they were in terrible distress, and the person before them paid for the groceries before they even showed up. I've heard that story many times. and it is a touching story about what is the real spirit and Australia's real response to these disasters.
Prime Minister, just following up on that, and also on Sam's question about holidays, whether it's decisions to take holiday or whether it's questions over the timing of the ADF deployment, the big question here is, has the government done enough soon enough? Australians elect leaders not just to respond to crisis, but to anticipate and prepare for them. What do you say to that big question about whether you were sufficiently prepared, sufficiently took this seriously enough to deploy as much help ahead of time as possible? What's your response to that big question?
Well, the big question is the response that people need right now and will continue to need right now. But in terms of the broader question that you've raised, the government at Commonwealth level, at state level, has responded based on the advice that was provided by commissioners and others through Emergency Management Australia to prepare us for the current fire season, and has taken the precautions in accordance with that advice. And I must say that advice accords with a lot of the sort of more public commentary about other advice that has been reported on. And that's why the extra 11 million went in this year, why it went in last year. That's why a lot of the arrangements that have been undertaken have been put in place. As I've said on a number of occasions, we had similar fears going into last year's fire season, and thankfully for that time they were not realised. This year they've been realised, and some, well beyond, I think, even what the most severe predictions were. And that's why the response that we've now escalated to has been lifted to that level. There are many views in hindsight, David, and that's why you have reviews to have the benefit of that hindsight to support you respond to future events, which no doubt will occur again in Australia. But the response that you undertake, the things that you prepare for, like the call-out, which was prepared for in November. The issues of income loss support, options prepared well in advance of that decision as well and activated upon the request of the New South Wales State Government. The options constantly being prepared, even the stand-up of the agency, as we're talking through now, has already been through some significant earlier runs in our response to previous arrangements, which means we can put them in place very, very quickly. The scale of the disaster is enormous. And it is a reminder of the terrible threat that nature provides in this country. And we will continue to seek to match that as best as human beings are able to do, working with everything that we have available to us. And my answer to Australians is yes, you can be confident that the government, the state government, the local governments, all agencies are putting everything they have into this and will continue to do to support their safety, to protect their homes, to protect their property, and then to rebuild both their lives and their communities and their homes and their businesses and their services as quickly as possible on the other side. I had one question there who's been very patient, and then I'm happy to take... I haven't much to add on to what I said on Iraq yesterday, but... Yeah.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Just on your ad detailing the ADF assistance, the Australian Defence Association has labelled it a clear breach of the non-partisanship convention applying to both the ADF and ministers. I just wanted your response on that.
Well, I think this issue has received a lot of attention. Let me just stress firstly that the postings that we've made in messages has been to inform the community about what the Commonwealth Government is doing. And that's what we must do. Wherever I've been, people have said, well, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you providing? What is the ADF doing? What payments are being made? Where are the aerial bombers? All of these things are the questions that have been put to me as Prime Minister. And it's important that I communicate what we are doing with the Australian people. As much as we'd all like to only rely on the reporting of the media to get those information out, I will also seek to carry that message directly to the Australian people to ensure that they are aware of what we are doing. Now, this is the same format that has been used to communicate these messages now for months, including the sorts of images that you referred to, and no objection has previously been made when that has been done. There has been some talk of the authorisation that sits on the end of that video message. That is a requirement of Australian law. It is not something that I can post on my social media page without carrying that authorisation. That does not mean it is a political message in any way, shape or form. It is just complying with Australian law. As you know, the opposition, the Labor Party and other parties have similar authorisations on the back of very similar types of messages that they have been conveying on their commentary about these events. So where that can be improved, I'm happy to take the helpful suggestions that have been made, but we've been acting in accordance with the same procedure we've had in place now for many, many months. But let me assure Australians, the purpose is just to communicate as simply and helpfully as we possibly can about what the government is doing to get resources, to get support to those places that need it. And it's important, I think, that the over-analysis of these things can create unnecessary anxiety, and we're simply seeking to help people know what we're doing.
Isn't there a difference between an Australian government-sponsored ad and a Liberal Party-sponsored ad? And the ads in tomorrow's papers...
Well, it wasn't a Liberal Party-sponsored ad.
It
was authorised by me. I'm the leader of the Liberal Party, and that's the only authorisation I can post on something that is posted on my page. And as you know, that is the same thing that applies to other politicians in Australia. It is simply complying with the requirements of Australian law, and to infer from that that there was some other purpose in these communications is I reject absolutely, and the commentary on that along those lines I think is false.
Well, these ads in tomorrow's papers explaining the rollout. Is the taxpayers going to fund them, or?
Well, those are being placed by the Australian Defence Forces directly under their own authority and under their own budgets for undertaking those, and they've been done at their decision.
Did the Liberal Party pay for this ad?
It was on Facebook. I mean, it's put together by my own office, and there are no real honest expenses that are of any significance that are attached to making a Facebook post.
Can I just ask where the CDF's assessment of the safety of Australian troops in Iraq is up to? Has there been a decision at this point to withdraw any troops from Iraq?
No. But as I said yesterday, these matters are under close observation and under continued review. But there are no decisions, or I'm not flagging any decisions that would be a decision that the government would be taking. But we will continue to take advice and assess the situation on the ground.
Just back on David's question. We're likely to see this disaster continue every year. Do you think there is a need to handle it differently, say next summer or the summer after?
Every summer we handle it differently. And every summer we handle it better. And every summer the response that is provided and the improved response that is provided undoubtedly ensures that we save more lives and we save more homes and we save more properties and we save more livelihoods. There's no doubt about that. After every event like this, we will all work together to do it even better next time. But I must say, as I said many months ago, our response to these calamitous bushfires is world-leading. Australia's firefighters, Australia's emergency services, Australia's defence forces are world leaders in responding to these events. And that is on display out there now. And as much as there will always be frustrations when you cannot, in all cases, completely counteract the forces of nature, there will undoubtedly be shortfalls and frustrations, undoubtedly. But what you do is you identify them and you seek to improve on the way that you address those challenges again in the future. But one thing we can always rely on is the good nature and amazing spirit of the Australian people. That assists greatly in how we respond to these crises and keeping the focus amongst our authorities on the things that we need to focus on. There are a lot of distractions out there at the moment. There's a lot of commentary out there on issues that are a long way away from the things that matter most, and that is getting help to the people who need it now. Phil.
Just on that, if I could ask a logistical question on behalf of people who are still out there in those fire areas. One of the biggest, apart from water, one of the scarcest commodities is fuel, especially diesel.
Yep.
And it's difficult, obviously. There's been runs on petrol stations and the fire trucks are using all the diesel down there, etc., etc.
Yep.
Would it be logistically possible, if necessary, for these ADF members not to commandeer petrol stations but to start supervising the distribution of fuel and the supply of fuel? There was instances where service stations were stocked but no one turned up to open them because they were out fighting fires and queues down the streets. that hampered the evacuation the other day. Is that something, and I know that's on the minds of people down there, is that something the Army can do?
Well, Phil, I know that was an experience you had most recently, and I appreciate you relaying that to us at the time, because that actually did factor into a lot of our thinking in recent days. And despite the amazing efforts of the New South Wales government on what was a very, very difficult day in supporting the evacuations that were taking place, there are obviously places that were under considerable stress and experienced the exact things that you talked about. That is why, through the call-out, one of the things that is on offer and is available, as is required, is to support if you like, the civil order of being able to facilitate those evacuations. But that is a decision that obviously has to be taken with the support of the state government. But this highlighted to me personally, when you raised that, of the need for a resource above and beyond what was reasonably expected to be able to provide it in every single corner of every single state that was affected by the fire. I want to stress this again. The scale of the deployment, which is unprecedented in Australia, and the federal response, whether it's in the payments we've made or the defence call-out and defence response, is an expression of the scale of the fires. That's what it is. Whether it's Commissioner Fitzsimmons or any of his colleagues, the state premiers, I have nothing but the highest praise for their efforts and every single one of those who serve under their command. It has been extraordinary. But, you know, there are no supernatural powers here, and that means that everybody needs support and assistance, and where the Commonwealth can step in and provide that in a proactive way, that's exactly what you're seeing. That's exactly what you'll continue to see over many months still to come now, proactively. As we said, the Adelaide sitting out there right now, out of Eden, able to move and will move with what it has available to it, whether it's the engineering equipment that's on board or the medical supplies or the other stores that are there, to be called in and deployed in close consultation with the states so that that effort can be well delivered on the ground for the people who are there. So I thank you very much for your attention, and there'll be further... Sorry?
Hazard reduction, you've expressed some concern about hazard reduction being a factor here or lack thereof, and that's borne out in some stats about perhaps not enough of it being done. Do you think that's an area where the federal government needs to take a stronger role, or even have some kind of takeover of the responsibilities in parkland areas?
Well, let me be clear first about the comments I've made on hazard reduction. They've been in response to questions like yours just now, and they have also reflected what I have been told on the ground, whether it's in East Gippsland or other parts of the country. So it would be no surprise to anyone who is closely associated with this that is a matter that I would say has been most commonly raised when I've been out and about. You're correct to say that those issues are run and overseen entirely by state governments, as many of the other issues that will come into play, whether it's planning and zoning laws and building codes and things of that nature. They are state responsibilities. And what's important, I think, in the first instance is to have a proper consideration of what the contribution of those factors are and what state and territory governments might do in response to those. But what I have noticed in this disaster, which has been, and I was talking to Prime Minister Howard this morning, former Prime Minister Howard this morning, in comparison with things that we've dealt with in the past, there has always been, I think, a good understanding of the first responder nature of state governments. But on this occasion, I think the scale of things has been calling for a more the role of national agencies, which have been there, as I've stressed, but how that flows on to these other questions of state responsibilities of hazard reduction and planning and development laws and things of that nature, I mean, that's fundamentally a discussion for the Federation. I think people like things to be as local as possible, and they want things to be delivered as locally as possible. That's always been my inclination. But you can have no doubt that we will provide the national perspective on this and integration and coordination using the authorities that we have. People want to see that, just as those I think wanted to see what we've announced yesterday and that we've built up to now for several weeks. And so we will work together to do all those things, but that's the key, Dave. We've got to work together. And we are working together, and we are working together incredibly well. And that's important, especially for the many months that we've still got to go on this issue. Anyway, I note again there will be an operational briefing by Defence, which the Minister will be there for, and that will provide more details on the granularity of what the Defence responses will be. That will be a daily briefing, and that will be provided by those who are operationally responsible. Thank you very much.
Do you have brought your family, you're now basing yourself in Canberra with your family?
Yes.
When did you decide to make that decision and why?
When we moved, obviously, to the announcement we made yesterday, and that we have the fires now moving in a much higher level in multiple states. Previously, the primary state that was feeling the heaviest of the burden was in New South Wales. That was before the Victorian fires that really escalated earlier this week. And we're standing up, particularly the Response Agency, which I've announced today, and the Recovery Agency, the Defence Force heightened operations on the new posture. It is better for me to be based here in Canberra than previously, where I could get more quickly to the New South Wales headquarters and move around some of the challenges in New South Wales where I previously was. Thank you.